Imagine a weapon so powerful, so terrifying, so unlike anything the world had ever seen, that the United States government spent over $5 billion building it, strapped it onto a commercial jumbo jet, and then quietly retired it before most people even knew it existed. Now imagine that this weapon could shoot down a ballistic missile traveling at thousands of miles per hour from hundreds of kilometers away, using nothing but concentrated light. Not bullets, not explosives, not a warhead of any kind. Just pure, focused, invisible energy traveling at the speed of light itself. That is not science fiction. That happened. And the story of how it happened, why it happened, and why it ultimately failed is one of the most fascinating, most expensive, and most quietly tragic stories in the entire history of American military aviation. We are talking about the YAL-1, the airborne laser, a modified Boeing 747-400F freighter aircraft that carried inside its massive fuselage a chemical oxygen iodine laser of such extraordinary power that it could, at least in theory, detect, track, and destroy a ballistic missile during the first few minutes of its flight, before it ever had a chance to deliver its warhead to its target. It was conceived during the Cold War. It was born in the chaos of the post-Cold War rethinking of American national security. It was developed through the 1990s and 2000s under a program so ambitious, so technically audacious, that many of the engineers who worked on it still describe it in tones of genuine wonder mixed with something approaching grief. And it was canceled in 2011, after years of cost overruns, technical setbacks, and a fundamental strategic debate about whether such a weapon was ever truly practical in the first place. But here's the thing. The story of the airborne laser is not just a story about a weapon. It is a story about American ambition. It is a story about the dreams that drive military technology forward and the hard realities that sometimes bring those dreams crashing back to Earth. It is a story about the scientists and engineers and pilots and generals who dedicated years, sometimes decades, of their lives to making something truly extraordinary happen. And in some ways, it is a story that is still unfolding today, because the questions that the airborne laser raised about directed energy weapons, about missile defense, about the future of warfare itself, those questions have never gone away. If anything, they are more urgent now than they have ever been. So sit back, because we are going to take this story from the very beginning. We are going to go back to the early days of the Cold War, when military scientists first started dreaming about using lasers as weapons. We are going to walk through the long, complicated, expensive, and genuinely thrilling journey that eventually produced the YAL-1. We're going to talk about how the aircraft actually worked, what it could do, what it could not do, and why the debates surrounding it were so fierce and so deeply consequential. And we are going to talk about what happened after it was canceled, and what its legacy means for the weapons that are being developed right now, today, in laboratories and test ranges around the world. This is a long story. It deserves to be told properly. Let us go back to 1960. The laser had just been invented. Theodore Maiman, a physicist working in California, had just demonstrated the first working laser using a synthetic ruby crystal and a flash lamp, and the scientific community was electric with excitement. Here was a device that could produce a beam of light so coherent, so tightly focused, so intense, that it seemed to belong in the pages of a science fiction novel rather than a real laboratory. Within weeks of the first laser demonstration, military planners in the United States and the Soviet Union were already asking the same question. Could this be used as a weapon? The answer, it turned out, was enormously complicated, and it would take several decades and many billions of dollars to fully understand just how complicated it was. The basic physics were appealing. A laser beam travels at the speed of light. You cannot outrun it. You cannot dodge it. You cannot shoot it down. If you could build a laser powerful enough and focus it precisely enough, you could in theory destroy any target you could see. Missiles, aircraft, satellites, ships. The application seemed almost limitless. But there were problems. There were enormous problems. The first problem was power. To damage a hardened military target, you need an extraordinary amount of energy concentrated in a very small area for long enough to heat the target's surface to the point of structural failure. The lasers of the early 1960s were nowhere near powerful enough to do that. They were impressive in the laboratory, but they were toys compared to what a military weapon would require. The second problem was atmosphere. Light. as it turns out, does not travel through air in a perfectly clean, straight, unimpeded line. Air is full of molecules, of water vapor, of dust particles, of turbulence, and all of these things scatter and distort a laser beam as it travels, reducing its power and degrading its focus in ways that get dramatically worse over longer distances. This effect is called atmospheric turbulence, and it is one of the fundamental enemies of any ground-based or airborne laser weapon system. The third problem, and in some ways the most fundamental problem, was targeting. A ballistic missile during its boost phase, the first few minutes after launch when its rocket engines are still burning, is moving very fast, thousands of miles per hour. It is also at long range, often hundreds of kilometers from any potential interceptor. To destroy it with a laser, you need to be able to track it with extraordinary precision. Keep your laser beam focused on the most vulnerable part of its structure, typically the fuel tank or the rocket nozzle, for long enough to cause catastrophic damage. Doing all of that simultaneously, while the aircraft carrying the laser is itself moving through turbulent air, while the missile is accelerating and changing its trajectory, while the atmosphere is constantly distorting your beam, is a problem of almost inconceivable technical difficulty. None of this stopped the military from trying. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, a series of research programs quietly explored the potential of laser weapons. The results were mixed. There were genuine breakthroughs, moments when a laser managed to damage a target in a test, moments when the beam quality improved beyond what anyone had thought possible. But there were also years of frustration, of programs that promised more than they could deliver, of technical obstacles that seemed to grow more formidable the closer you got to them. The real turning point came in 1983. That was when President Ronald Reagan stood up in front of the American public and announced what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the press almost immediately nicknamed Star Wars. Reagan's vision was sweeping and almost breathtaking in its ambition. He wanted to build a comprehensive defensive shield, using a combination of ground-based and space-based technologies that could intercept and destroy Soviet ballistic missiles before they could reach American territory. It was a direct challenge to the entire strategic logic of the Cold War, which had been built around the concept of mutual assured destruction, the idea that neither side would launch a nuclear strike, because doing so would guarantee their own annihilation. Reagan wanted to make that logic obsolete. He wanted to build a system that could actually defend against nuclear missiles rather than simply threaten retaliation. The reaction was fierce and divided. Military scientists were excited. The funding that came with the Strategic Defense Initiative was unlike anything that had ever been directed toward directed energy research before. Suddenly, there was real money, serious money, for laser research, for particle beam research, for all the exotic technologies that had been struggling along on modest budgets for 2 decades. But critics were equally intense in their opposition. They argued that a comprehensive missile defense was physically impossible, that the Soviet Union would simply build more missiles to overwhelm any conceivable defense, and that the whole program was a dangerous fantasy that would destabilize the arms control agreements that had kept the Cold War from turning hot. The debate was loud, politically charged, and never fully resolved. But inside the laboratories, the work went on. And one of the most important things that happened during the Strategic Defense Initiative era was the maturation of a particular type of laser technology that would eventually become the heart of the airborne laser program. This was the chemical laser, and specifically the hydrogen fluoride and deuterium fluoride lasers that researchers had been working on since the early 1970s. These were not the kind of lasers you might picture when you think of a laser pointer or a laser cutter in a factory. These were massive, industrial-scale devices that generated their laser beam through a chemical reaction rather than through electricity. They were enormously powerful, capable in principle of producing megawatt-scale laser beams, which is several orders of magnitude more powerful than anything a conventional electrically pumped laser could achieve at that time. But they were also complicated, temperamental, and they required large quantities of toxic and corrosive chemicals to operate, which created its own set of logistical and safety challenges. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the chemical laser technology had advanced to the point where it was genuinely impressive. The Miracle, which stood for Mid-Infrared Advanced Chemical Laser, had been built at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico and had demonstrated laser power levels in the megawatt range. which was the threshold that weapons researchers had identified as necessary for engaging targets at operationally meaningful ranges. The technology was real. The question now was whether you could package it into a system that could actually be used in the real world. That question became much more urgent after the Gulf War of 1991. One of the defining images of that conflict, at least in terms of weapons technology, was the Patriot missile system attempting to intercept Iraqi Scud ballistic missiles as they flew toward Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Patriot performed reasonably well in some engagements and quite poorly in others, and the experience highlighted both the importance of ballistic missile defense and the limitations of the existing systems. Military planners came away from the Gulf War with a renewed sense of urgency about the missile threat. Rogue states that did not have thousands of nuclear weapons but might have a handful of ballistic missiles with chemical or biological or even nuclear warheads, represented a qualitatively different kind of threat than the massive Soviet arsenal that had shaped American strategic thinking for decades. And for dealing with that kind of threat, the boost phase, the first few minutes of flight when the missile is still over hostile territory and has not yet deployed any decoys or maneuvering warheads, was clearly the ideal time to intercept it. This was the strategic context in which the Airborne laser program was born. In 1992, the United States Air Force began seriously studying the possibility of mounting a high-energy laser on an aircraft and using it to destroy ballistic missiles during their boost phase. The concept was appealing for several reasons. An aircraft could be positioned well outside a hostile nation's borders, beyond the range of most air defense systems, and still potentially engage missiles during their boost phase. Because boost phase missiles are moving relatively slowly, they are emitting an enormous and easily detectable infrared signature from their rocket exhaust. And they are structurally vulnerable because they are basically large, thin-walled fuel tanks under enormous stress from their own acceleration. The key insight was altitude. If you could fly the laser high enough, above most of the dense lower atmosphere where turbulence and water vapor were worst, you could dramatically extend the effective range of your laser. And a 747 could fly very high enough to potentially engage missiles hundreds of kilometers away, which would allow the aircraft to operate from international airspace while still covering large areas of potentially hostile territory. In 1996, after several years of study and competition, the Air Force awarded a contract to a team led by Boeing, with TRW and Lockheed Martin as major subcontractors, to develop the Airborne laser system. The contract was initially structured around a program to demonstrate the technology by 2003, with a potential path to operational deployment thereafter. The core of the system would be a chemical oxygen iodine laser, which researchers referred to as COIL. This was a more advanced type of chemical laser than the Miracle, one that operated at a wavelength, 1.315 micrometers in the near-infrared, that propagated through the atmosphere more efficiently than the longer wavelengths used by earlier chemical lasers. It had been developed through the 1980s partly for the Strategic Defense Initiative, and by the mid-1990s it had demonstrated power levels that the program team believed were sufficient for the missile defense mission. The aircraft chosen for the program was the Boeing 747-400F, a freighter version of the iconic jumbo jet. The choice made sense for several reasons. The 747 was large enough to carry the enormous laser system, which filled most of the aircraft's lower fuselage and included multiple laser modules, miles of plumbing for the reactive chemicals, and an enormous amount of support equipment. It had the range and endurance to fly long patrol missions. It could reach high altitudes, typically operating around 40,000 feet or higher for laser engagements. And Boeing, as the prime contractor, knew the aircraft intimately. The aircraft was designated YAL-1, with the Y indicating it was a prototype, the A indicating it was a modified aircraft as opposed to a purpose-built weapons platform, the L indicating laser, and the 1 indicating it was the first of its kind. The modifications required to turn a commercial 747 into a laser weapon platform were extraordinary. The nose of the aircraft was replaced with a large turret housing the beam control system, a sophisticated optical assembly that could track a target, measure atmospheric distortion, and compensate for that distortion in real time using a technique called adaptive optics. Adaptive optics is genuinely remarkable technology. It works by shining a lower-powered probe laser at the target, measuring how the atmosphere distorts that beam as it travels, and then using that information to predistort the outgoing high-energy beam in the opposite way, so that by the time the beam reaches the target, the atmospheric distortion has been compensated for and the beam arrives with its power properly focused. The system could do this thousands of times per second, continuously adapting to the ever-changing atmospheric conditions. Inside the aircraft, the main laser system consisted of multiple coil laser modules arranged in a ring, all of whose outputs were combined into a single beam. Combining multiple laser beams into one coherent beam is another genuinely difficult technical problem, requiring extraordinary precision in aligning the optical paths of each individual module. The chemicals required for the laser were stored in large tanks in the lower fuselage, and the aircraft carried enough chemical reactants for a limited number of full-power laser shots, the exact number depending on the power level and duration of each engagement. There were also two lower-powered lasers on board. One was the track illuminator laser, which was used to precisely locate and track the target. The other was the beacon illuminator laser, which was used for the adaptive optics system to measure atmospheric turbulence. These all had to work together seamlessly, in a precise sequence, to execute a successful engagement. First, the aircraft's infrared sensors would detect the missile's exhaust plume. Then the track illuminator would acquire and precisely track the missile. Then the beacon illuminator would measure the atmospheric turbulence along the path to the missile. Then the beam control system would apply the appropriate adaptive optics correction. And then the main high-energy laser would fire, holding its beam on the most vulnerable part of the missile's skin for the several seconds needed to heat it to the point of structural failure, causing the missile to break apart under the aerodynamic and propulsive forces it was experiencing. The whole sequence, from detection to kill, was designed to happen in a matter of seconds, which was necessary because the boost phase of a ballistic missile lasts only a few minutes before the rocket burns out and the warhead begins its ballistic trajectory. Building all of this was genuinely hard. Not hard in the sense of well-understood engineering challenges that just require careful work and sufficient resources, but hard in the sense of fundamental scientific and engineering unknowns that had to be solved from scratch. The adaptive optics required to compensate for atmospheric turbulence at megawatt laser power levels had never been built before. The beam combination system for multiple coil modules had never been demonstrated at the required power levels. The airborne vibration environment of a 747 posed challenges for the precision optical systems that ground-based laser researchers had never had to deal with. And the entire system had to be integrated into a flying aircraft and made to work reliably in operational conditions, which added layers of complexity that laboratory demonstrations simply could not prepare you for. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, the program made real progress, but it also encountered real setbacks, and the schedule began to slip and the costs began to rise. The original demonstration target of 2003 was pushed back. The cost estimates grew. Congressional scrutiny increased. There were questions about whether the technology would ever mature enough to be practical, questions about what it would cost to build an operational fleet of airborne laser aircraft, questions about whether the operational concept made sense given the realities of how and where you would actually use the system. But there were also genuine successes. The individual technology demonstrations were impressive. The coil laser modules achieved their power targets. The adaptive optics system demonstrated its ability to compensate for atmospheric distortion. The beam control system showed it could track fast-moving targets with the required precision. And then, in 2007, there was a milestone that the program had been working toward for years. The YAL-1 aircraft, flying for the first time with its full laser system installed, successfully tracked a surrogate target using its beam control system in flight. It was not yet a lethal engagement, but it was a demonstration that the fundamental concept worked in the air, not just on the ground. The real test came on February 11, 2010. On that night, the YAL-1 took off from Edwards Air Force Base in California and flew out over the Pacific Ocean, where a team at San Nicolas Island was preparing to launch a liquid-fueled ballistic missile target. The YAL-1 detected the launch, acquired the target, engaged the beam control system, and fired its high-energy laser. The missile was destroyed. For the first time in history, an airborne laser had shot down a ballistic missile in flight. It was a genuine, unambiguous, physical demonstration that the core concept of the airborne laser was not just theoretically possible, but actually achievable. Less than a month later, on March 15, 2010, the YAL-1 did it again, shooting down a second ballistic missile target. 2 for 2. The engineers and scientists who had spent years on the program were ecstatic. Here was proof. Here was real, physical, undeniable proof that you could put a laser on a 747 and use it to shoot down ballistic missiles. But by then, the program's fate had already been largely decided. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates had been skeptical of the airborne laser for years, and in his 2010 budget proposal, he had already recommended reducing the program to a research effort rather than a development program aimed at operational deployment. The reasons were multiple, and in some cases quite fundamental. The first problem was range. The successful missile intercepts in 2010 were conducted at relatively short ranges, well under 100 kilometers. For the operational concept to work, the aircraft needed to be able to engage missiles from several hundred kilometers away to keep it safely outside the range of air defense systems near hostile territory. At those longer ranges, atmospheric effects were more severe, the beams spread more, and the power density on the target dropped dramatically. Achieving the required lethal range with a single aircraft-mounted coil laser system was going to require either dramatically more laser power than the current system could produce, or a much larger aircraft, or some combination of both. The physics were not cooperating. The second problem was vulnerability. A 747, even a military-modified one, is not a stealthy aircraft. It is enormous, it has a significant radar cross-section, and it is not particularly fast or maneuverable. Operating it close enough to hostile territory to engage missiles during boost phase, which by definition means operating it near the borders of the nation doing the launching, meant exposing it to air defense threats, to fighter aircraft, to long-range surface-to-air missiles. Protecting the aircraft would require a significant escort force, adding complexity and cost to every operational mission. The third problem was logistics. The coil laser required large quantities of iodine and hydrogen peroxide as its primary chemical reactants, plus chlorine gas for the chemical reaction that generated the excited iodine atoms that produced the laser light. These are not materials you want to handle casually. Hydrogen peroxide at the concentrations required is a powerful oxidizer that can cause fires and explosions if mishandled. Chlorine gas is highly toxic. Iodine is corrosive. Storing, transporting, loading, and handling these chemicals in a military operational environment, potentially in austere forward bases in crisis regions, was a logistical challenge that grew more daunting the more carefully you thought about it. And because the aircraft could only carry enough chemicals for a limited number of shots, every mission had to be carefully planned around how many engagements you might need to conduct. The fourth problem, perhaps the most fundamental problem of all, was cost. The development program had already cost several $billion, and it had produced a single prototype aircraft that could engage targets at ranges well short of what would be operationally required. To build even a small operational fleet of aircraft with improved lasers capable of achieving the necessary range would require enormous additional investment. Investment that military planners increasingly felt could be better spent on other missile defense capabilities that were already proven and deployable. Robert Gates announced in February 2012 that the YAL-1 program was being terminated. The aircraft was flown to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, the famous boneyard where retired military aircraft are stored in the dry desert air and placed in long-term storage. Later it was demilitarized and the fuselage was eventually scrapped, though some of the optical and sensor components were retained for research purposes. The program that had consumed over $5 billion and the working lives of thousands of engineers and scientists was over. The reaction among those who had worked on the program was complicated. There was grief, of course. There is always grief when a program that you have given years of your life to is canceled. But there was also, among many of the participants, a clear-eyed recognition that the critics had raised legitimate points. The operational concept had real vulnerabilities. The logistics were genuinely difficult. The cost was genuinely high. And the question of whether the system could have been made to work at the operationally required ranges was one that had never been definitively answered. But there was also pride. Genuine, justified pride in what had been accomplished. The team had built something that had never existed before. They had solved problems that had never been solved. They had put a megawatt-class laser on a 747 and flown it at 40,000 feet and used it to shoot down ballistic missiles. That is not nothing. That is, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary technical achievement, one that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible and generated knowledge and technology that would outlive the program itself. And indeed, the legacy of the airborne laser has been considerable. The adaptive optics technology developed for the program has found applications well beyond missile defense. The understanding of how high-power laser beams propagate through the atmosphere, built up over years of theoretical and experimental work on the airborne laser, underpins much of the directed energy weapon development happening today. The beam combination techniques developed for the coil modules have influenced later work on fiber laser arrays and other advanced laser architectures. And perhaps most importantly, the program demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, that airborne directed energy weapons are physically possible, that they can work, that the basic concept is sound. The question is not whether directed energy weapons can work. The question is how to make them work in a way that is operationally practical and cost-effective. And that question is being asked with renewed urgency today, because the world has changed since the airborne laser was canceled. The proliferation of ballistic missiles has continued. More countries have them. They are more capable. They are harder to intercept with traditional kinetic interceptors. The cost of kinetic missile defense, using expensive interceptor missiles to shoot down incoming threats, has become a major strategic concern, particularly as adversaries have developed the ability to saturate defense systems with large numbers of lower-cost missiles. In this environment, directed energy weapons, which can engage targets at the speed of light and at a cost per shot that is a tiny fraction of the cost of a kinetic interceptor, look increasingly attractive. The technology has also continued to advance. The chemical lasers of the YAL-1 era have been largely superseded by solid-state lasers and fiber lasers powered by electricity rather than chemicals. These systems do not require the complex and hazardous chemical handling that was one of the major operational limitations of the coil. They can be recharged as long as they have electrical power, which on a military aircraft means as long as the engines are running. They are, in principle, much more operationally flexible. And while they have not yet achieved the raw power levels of the best chemical lasers, the gap has been closing steadily, driven by enormous advances in the efficiency and beam quality of electrically pumped laser systems. The United States Air Force has been actively developing high-energy laser weapon systems for aircraft, including programs aimed at self-defense applications and potentially more offensive roles. The High-Energy Laser Weapon System program and various successor efforts have been working to mature solid-state laser technology to the point where it can be integrated into tactical aircraft. The results have been promising, though the power levels achieved so far are still well below what would be required for boost-phase missile defense at strategic ranges. Other nations have been pursuing directed energy weapons with great intensity. Russia has announced and reportedly deployed laser-based systems, including what it calls the Paras-VET, a high-energy laser system primarily intended for anti-satellite and counter-drone roles. China has been investing heavily in directed energy research and has reportedly tested various high-powered laser systems. The competition in directed energy weapons that the airborne laser program helped inaugurate has continued and intensified in the years since the program was canceled. There is also a new operational context that makes the boost phase laser concept more relevant than ever. The rise of hypersonic missiles, glide vehicles that travel at speeds above Mach 5 and can maneuver throughout their flight, has created a class of threats that existing kinetic interceptors are poorly suited to defeat. Hypersonic vehicles are hard to track, hard to predict, and hard to intercept in their terminal phase. Boost phase, the period before they have reached hypersonic speeds and have not yet begun their terminal maneuvers, remains one of the most attractive windows for interception. And a laser, traveling at the speed of light and capable of engaging targets at very long range, is in principle well suited to boost phase intercept in a way that traditional interceptors are not. Could a future, more capable version of the airborne laser concept address the operational limitations that doomed the original program? The answer is genuinely uncertain. The range problem, the need to hold killing power on target at several hundred kilometers, remains formidable. Atmospheric turbulence does not get easier with more advanced technology. It is a fundamental physical reality. Adaptive optics can compensate, but they cannot eliminate the problem. Getting enough power on a distant target through hundreds of kilometers of imperfect air is a challenge that will require either very high laser power, very large aperture optics, or both, all packaged in an aircraft that is itself tactically survivable. The vulnerability problem has potentially been addressed, at least partially, by advances in standoff range. If a future laser system could engage at genuinely long ranges, perhaps with the help of relay or focusing systems, the aircraft might be able to operate from positions safe from most air defense threats. But this requires the laser power and beam quality to be dramatically better than anything that has yet been demonstrated airborne. The logistics problem has been largely addressed by the transition from chemical lasers to electrically pumped systems, which is a genuine and significant advance. The safety and operational simplicity of a solid-state or fiber laser system, running on jet fuel converted to electricity by the aircraft's engines, is enormously better than the chemical laser approach. This is one area where the technology has genuinely moved in a favorable direction since the YAL-1 era. The cost problem is more complex. The cost of directed energy weapon development remains very high, but the cost per engagement is potentially very low, especially compared to kinetic interceptors. In an era where adversaries are developing cost-effective ballistic and cruise missile threats by the hundreds and thousands, the economics of directed energy defense look increasingly attractive. The question is whether the upfront development and procurement costs can be justified, and the answer to that depends heavily on your assessment of the threat environment and the alternatives available. What is clear is that the airborne laser was not the end of the story. It was, in retrospect, more like the end of the beginning. It was the proof of concept, the demonstration that the fundamental physics worked, the moment when directed energy weapons moved from theoretical possibility to demonstrated reality. Everything that comes after, all the work being done today on high-energy lasers for aircraft, for ships, for ground vehicles, for space, builds on the foundation that the YAL-1 program laid. Think about the people who built it. The engineers at TRW, later acquired by Northrop Grumman, who spent years perfecting the coil modules and the beam combination system. The optical scientists who developed the adaptive optics algorithms that could compensate for atmospheric turbulence in real time. The systems engineers at Boeing who figured out how to pack all of this technology into a flying aircraft and make it work together. The test pilots who flew the YAL-1 on its hundreds of test missions, learning how to operate this remarkable and in some ways terrifying machine. The military program managers who fought for the program through years of budget battles and technical setbacks and changing strategic priorities. All of these people were working on something genuinely new, something that had never been done before, and they made it work. There is something almost heartbreaking about the end of the program, when you think about it that way. After all those years, after all that work, after achieving 2 successful missile intercepts that proved the concept beyond any reasonable doubt, the aircraft was flown to the desert and parked and eventually scrapped. The team was dispersed. The program was canceled. The future that they had been building toward was deferred indefinitely. But deferred is not the same as abandoned. The technology continued to develop. The lessons learned from the airborne laser program continued to inform research and development. And the strategic logic that drove the program in the first place, the desire to intercept ballistic missiles during their boost phase, before they can deliver their warheads, before they can release decoys, while they are still over hostile territory, and while their operators still have time to realize that something has gone terribly wrong. That logic remains as compelling today as it ever was. We live in a world where the ballistic missile threat is more diverse, more geographically dispersed, and in some ways more dangerous than it was at the height of the Cold War. The major powers have reduced their nuclear arsenals somewhat from the insane peaks of the 1980s, but the number of countries with ballistic missiles has grown, and the sophistication of those missiles has grown with it. North Korea has demonstrated intercontinental ballistic missiles and what appear to be thermonuclear warheads. Iran has a substantial ballistic missile force and continues to develop longer-range systems. China has been investing heavily in ballistic and hypersonic missile systems designed specifically to defeat American naval power projection in the Western Pacific. Russia has modernized its entire nuclear arsenal and developed a range of novel strategic weapons. The missile threat that the airborne laser was designed to address has not diminished. If anything, it has grown more complex. In response to this, the United States continues to invest in missile defense, including directed energy approaches. The Missile Defense Agency has funded research into high-energy laser systems for various platforms and roles. The Navy has been deploying ship-based solid-state lasers for defense against drones and small boats, and is working toward higher power systems for more demanding threats. The Army has been testing laser systems for counter-drone and counter-rocket roles. The Air Force has been developing laser systems for aircraft self-defense and potentially more offensive roles. All of this work traces its lineage, in some way, back to the YAL-1 and the foundation of knowledge and technology that the Airborne laser program built. And there are researchers today, in laboratories and on test ranges, who are thinking very seriously about a next-generation airborne boost phase laser system. Not necessarily a 747 with a chemical laser, but perhaps a large unmanned aircraft with a high-power fiber or solid-state laser, operating at very high altitude, potentially using advanced beam control and atmospheric compensation techniques that did not exist when the YAL-1 was designed. Could such a system overcome the range and vulnerability limitations that doomed the original airborne laser? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. The physics remain challenging. The engineering problems remain formidable. But the gap between what is theoretically possible and what has actually been demonstrated has narrowed considerably since the YAL-1 first flew. The dream that drove the airborne laser program, the dream of a weapon that could reach out at the speed of light and neutralize a ballistic missile in the first moments of its flight, before it could threaten anyone, has not died. It has been deferred, complicated, tested against reality, and in some ways refined by the hard lessons of the YAL-1 program. But it persists. It persists because the need persists. It persists because the physics, while challenging, do not preclude it. And it persists because there is something deeply compelling, almost irresistible, about the idea of a defense that moves at the speed of light. The story of the YAL-1 is ultimately a story about the gap between vision and reality, and about the long, difficult, expensive, often heartbreaking work required to close that gap. It is a story about what happens when you take an idea that seems almost impossibly ambitious, a laser weapon on a jumbo jet that can shoot down missiles from hundreds of miles away, and you commit to actually building it, actually flying it, actually testing it against real targets. You learn things you could not have learned any other way. You solve problems you did not know existed. You achieve things that seemed impossible. And you run into limitations that force you to be honest about the distance that remains between where you are and where you wanted to be. The $5 billion spent on the airborne laser was not wasted. That money bought knowledge, technology, and demonstration that no amount of theoretical analysis could have produced. It bought the adaptive optics breakthroughs. It bought the beam combination techniques. It bought the atmospheric propagation data. It bought 2 successful missile intercepts over the Pacific Ocean. It bought a generation of engineers and scientists who understand, at a deep and practical level, what it actually takes to build and operate an airborne laser weapon. All of that has value. All of that has continued to bear fruit in the programs that followed. And perhaps most importantly, it proved something that needed to be proved. It proved that the concept was physically sound. It proved that you could put a laser on an airplane and fly it and shoot down ballistic missiles with it. Everything else, the range problem, the vulnerability problem, the cost problem, those are engineering and operational challenges, difficult ones certainly, but challenges that can in principle be addressed with better technology, better aircraft, better operational concepts. They are not evidence that the basic idea is wrong. They are the problems that the next generation of directed energy weapon programs is working to solve. So the next time you look up at a commercial 747 flying overhead, think about what was once done with one of those aircraft. Think about the extraordinary, audacious, expensive, imperfect, genuinely remarkable thing that a team of American engineers and scientists and military professionals built over the course of nearly 2 decades. Think about the laser that filled its fuselage and the chemicals that powered that laser and the sophisticated optical systems that focused that laser's beam across hundreds of miles of turbulent air and held it steady on a missile moving at thousands of miles per hour. Think about the February night over the Pacific Ocean when that beam found its target and a ballistic missile broke apart in the dark sky. Think about all the things that had to be true, all the problems that had to be solved, all the work that had to be done for that moment to happen. It was one of the most remarkable things that has ever been done with an airplane. And the story is not over. Now I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this carefully. The airborne laser was canceled partly because of cost, partly because of operational limitations, and partly because the technology of the time could not fully bridge the gap between what was demonstrated and what was operationally required. But technology keeps advancing. Solid-state lasers are getting more powerful. Unmanned aircraft are becoming more capable. Atmospheric compensation techniques are improving. So here's the question for you. Do you think a next-generation airborne boost phase laser system, built with today's technology and informed by everything we learned from the YAL-1, could finally overcome those limitations and become a real operational weapon? Or do you think the fundamental physics and operational challenges are too formidable, and that the boost phase laser concept is destined to remain just beyond reach, no matter how advanced the technology becomes? Leave your answer in the comments below. And while you are down there, if this story grabbed you the way it grabbed me, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one, stories of extraordinary ambition, of technology pushing against the edges of the possible, of the weapons and machines that have shaped the world we live in, and every one of them deserves to be told.